Good evening, everyone. I am delighted to welcome you to the third and final lecture of our Connecticut River Spring Lecture Series. We first met Hans Daum when he agreed to serve on the Science Advisory Board of the Roger Torrey Peterson Estuary Center. Born and raised in Caracas, Venezuela, Hans came to the United States on an academic scholarship, receiving a Bachelor of Science degree from the University of Washington and a PhD from the University of New York at Stony Brook, both in oceanology. Sorry, Hans. Since 1991, he has been a professor and researcher at the University of Connecticut's Department of Marine Sciences at Avery Point, where, and I can't resist saying this, he works in the Lowell Weicker building. With more than 100 scientific papers and book chapters to his credit, Dr. Daum is a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the Association for the Study of Limnology and Oceanology, the Connecticut Academy of Science and Engineering, and the Connecticut Academy of Arts and Sciences, of which he is also vice president. His area of study is planktonic organisms, particularly copepods. This evening, he will tell us about these little creatures, their ecology and evolution. And as tiny organisms, they go, for the most part, undetected by the human eye. And as such, are a very much underappreciated, really, organism for the important role that they play in life, the health of our marine ecosystems, our economy, and our planet. Like all creatures, they have to cope with rapidly evolving environmental conditions brought on by global climate change. So I am delighted tonight to introduce Dr. Hans Daum of the University of Connecticut and the Roger Torrey Peterson Estuary Center's Science Advisory Board. Welcome, Hans.
Thank you, Claudia, and for the invitation and for the audience to show up. It's a beautiful spring day, and I'm happy that you're all here. So it turns out that the life of plankton, it's actually an open secret. It's only a secret to us because we don't get to peer into their view, into their world every day. But once we take the time to look beyond the surface, we can unravel what at first sight might seem secret, and at the same time find common ground with these humble yet noble creatures, the plankton. So my first goal for today, it's very simple. And given that this is an Audubon Society talk, I need to make an analogy to birds. We all recognize this drawing as a bird from our everyday common experience. And it may be that your understanding of plankton is at this level right now. Now, I am a terrible ornithologist myself, but I can see that all of this here are birds. I don't know what they are. This is a bird, and this is a bird, and this is a bird to me, but I can yet appreciate their beauty and their diversity and all the things that they do in nature. And my job today is to help you start getting that appreciation for plankton. A second, more ambitious goal tonight is to make a connection between plankton and our lives, from the air we breathe to the fuels that run our economies, the food that we consume, that we eat from the sea, and even the evolution of human consciousness. And I know that there is a big jump from plankton to that, but it is there, believe me. And now this consciousness has blessed us with the ability to do amazing things like science and literature and architecture, design, and art. And it turns out that those endeavors, architecture and art and design, draw themselves inspiration from Plankton. And lastly, I want to make the case that all is not well in the world of plankton, that there are issues that the ocean is facing that involve plankton. But to solve those problems, we need to engage in a three-way process, which is discovery and understanding of the problems, and finally action, moving us to action. And it is only through this first two that we can manage or solve the societal problems that we're facing in relation to the ocean. So what are plankton? That's the first question, right? Plankton are a hugely diverse group of organisms defined by one feature. They live unattached in water and are at the mercy of horizontal currents. So this is an illustration of different kinds of plankton here. And it shows also the scale for their sizes. Now, plankton are embedded in water and drift with horizontal currents, but it doesn't mean that they cannot move. In fact, they can move and they even swim, yet their velocities are too small to overcome that of the currents. Now, later we will see that this does not mean they're incapable of controlling some of their motion. I'll give you several illustrations of that. So plankton includes things which are very tiny, such as viruses in the ocean, not shown in these pictures, they would be around here in the scale. Bacteria that are illustrated here by these little green dots. Tiny plants called phytoplankton that are illustrated by these three icons here. Protozoans, which are animal-like single-cell organisms illustrated by the furry thing here. And the true animals, which are called the zooplankton, which are roughly 1 millimeter or larger in size. All right. And for those of you who don't like the metric system, here is the English system. Recommendation, let's get rid of that. Let's stick with the metric system. But if you must here, it is in inches. And I'd like to put this into perspective. Because this is really, really, really tiny, right? So as you can see here, this is roughly half an inch when we get to 10 millimeters or so. Now, if we put this into perspective in relative proportion, we can say that if the smallest planter here is the size of this chair, by the time we get to these fellows here over on this end, we would be talking about something the size of a small city like Manhattan, right? And the protozoan here would be something equivalent to the Eiffel Tower. So even though they're tiny, in relative terms, there's a huge spread of sizes among them. So we've known about plankton for the last 300 years or so, but particularly in the last 150 years. And I'm just going to give you a quick overview of how we collect them and how we know about them. And the early work was done with very fine mesh that was strained through the water to collect the animals. And here is a picture of a famous zoologist, German zoologist called Ernest Haeckel, that is also famous for some of the most beautiful depictions of plankton in history. And I'll be showing quite a few of those throughout the presentation. And here's a very primitive plankton net of the time. But we can also collect plankton using deployable bottles from boats. And that's usually done for the tiny one for the phytoplankton. Or we can dive and collect them when it comes to the very fragile gelatinous zooplankton, particularly if we're going to use them for live observations. Or we can deploy video systems in the ocean where we can get pictures of the organisms in their habitat. Or finally, we can use satellites and detect remotely the pigments of planktonic organisms. So there's a variety of ways by which we know where they live and where they are and how many of them there are. So let me give you an illustration of the major groups of phytoplankton before we talk about how they're related to our existence. The first ones are phytoplankton, which are, in my view, the tiny forests in the ocean. Now, all of these organisms photosynthesize. And what that means is that they take CO2 that is dissolved in the water, and in combination with light and nutrients, they convert the CO2 into carbohydrates, essentially sugars, which is used to run their cells, their organisms. And importantly, in the process, they produce oxygen, which is essential for our lives. So the major players of the phytoplankton are the cyanobacteria, illustrated here by this blue-greenish algae, tiny single cell algae, that are famous for being the first organisms to perform photosynthesis in the history of the Earth. We have the diatoms that are famous for their silica shells, which essentially means that they live in glass houses. So they don't throw stones, all right? They live in glass houses. We have, and by the way, the blooms of diatoms provide the food that fuels most fisheries in mid and high latitudes. The coccolithophores are named by these plates on their shells that look like shields, defensive shields, and they're famous because they're made out of limestone. And when they bloom, they have these massive blooms, and this is, I think, in Alaska. So this whole area is about the size of southern New England, and this is an entire bloom of coccolithophores that has been detected from space, from satellites. And they turn the water milky white. And finally, we have a major group called the dinoflagellates that are characterized by having two flagella, two little whips that allow them to move in the water column. And they're famous for their production of bioluminescence, which is illustrated in this slide here. And they're infamous for their production of myriad forms of toxins that affect public health. And later on, I'll talk about some of the problems we're facing with the proliferations of this toxic phytoplankton. Now, when you hear the word grazers, because I'm talking about these little protozoans and I'm calling them grazers, what you typically think of is cows feeding on pasture land. So these are essentially, these protozoa are the equivalents of cows in the sea. They eat most of the plant material that is produced in the ocean. And an example of that is this tiny organisms called ciliates here. Cilia are the little hairs that you see protruding here. And in this particular case, the ciliate is full of plants, and that's what makes it green, okay? Amazingly, some of these ciliates have adopted a lifestyle that is quite useful to them, which is after they digest the food, they keep the bits of the food that bear the pigments that photosynthesize and essentially perform photosynthesis themselves. So they eat the food, they keep the pigments, and they continue to photosynthesize. So when there's no food around, they draw on this. So it's in other words, it's like having solar panels, the panels that can run your house, your electric power grid when there's no power. The other group that I'm illustrating just because they're so beautiful are the radiolaria. And here's an illustration that I mentioned by the famous zoologist Ernest Haeckel that shows the magnificent architecture of this tiny protozoa that can either be herbivores, grazers like the ciliates, or eat other tiny prey themselves. And we'll come back to the radiolaria where we're talking about the connection to art and plankton. And then when we move to the bigger things, the multicellular organisms, the real animals, the kings are represented by this group called the copepods, which are very dear to my heart because those are the animals that I tend to study. Now, I said that they're the most abundant animals on Earth. That's because they're more abundant than insects and they're more abundant than nematodes, which are the most numerous things on land. And they're also incredibly important because they are the main food source for larval fish. So no copepods, no fish, for example. This is what a copepod looks like once it's hatched from an egg. It looks like a little Pokemon or a star, a tiny star, but eventually they metamorphose into this torpedo shape form. And here's some examples again from Haeckel's illustrations of a century ago of tropical copepods. And you can see that they can be incredibly ornate and colorful. And finally, we get to the soft yet mighty gelatinous zooplankton. And some examples are the medusae, again, an illustration from Haeckel's work, incredibly beautiful animals, and the siphonophores, which is illustrated by this organism here. So the medusae and the siphonophores are both true jellyfish, cnidarians, and they're famous or infamous for their nematocysts, their poisonous harpoon that immobilize prey and so that they can be eaten. Now, there are other things that are jelly-like, but they're not jellyfish. One of them is the ctenophore, and those are they're also called sea gooseberries or cum jellies, and you see lots of these in Long Island Sound during summer. Now, these are not, they don't sting, but they're voracious predators. They'll eat anything in front of them. But you need not worry, these are tiny, right? These are just an inch or so in size, but they'll eat all the copepods, for example, that they find. And finally, we have the salps, which are, again, gelatinous. And what you see here, and here's a diver for scale. So this is quite a large organism. Each one of these bits that you see, it's an animal, so they form a colony. Now, salps are somewhat related to us because they have the most primitive forms of spines, the notochord. So they are the predecessors to invertebrates. So now that you know a little bit about the major players of plankton in the ocean, the question is how many of them are there? And it turns out there's just a staggering number of them. And again, it pays to compare them to something we can relate to, which is the human population. So we know that as of now, it's almost 8 billion of us on the planet, almost 8 billion individuals, right? So if we now compare that to copepods, which are the most abundant animals in the ocean, it turns out there's a billion of them. So there's actually a billion more copepods than there are humans on Earth. And now if we compare the copepods to this type of cyanobacteria called Prochlorococcus, that's a mouthful. It turns out these fellows are a billion in abundance, right? So a billion more than copepods and a billion more than humans. I mean, that is an incredible number. That's 10 with 27 zeros that follow after that. Interestingly, if you combine the weight of all humans and compare that to the weight of all copepods or the weight of all cyanobacteria, they're about the same, right? So all copepods combined weigh as much as humans, and all Prochlorococcus combined weigh as much as humans themselves. And by the way, Prochlorococcus is actually the most abundant organism in the planet. There's nothing that comes close to it in terms of abundance. So it's a huge number of planktonic organisms out there. All right, so, but I've told you that copepods are tiny. I'm sorry, the plankton in general are tiny. I tend to say copepods a lot because I'm so enamored of them. Plankton are tiny, and that creates some very alien-like conditions. Alien in the sense that it's hard for us to relate to them. So let me show, I need to show a video here. Okay, so what you've just saw there, it's a tiny copepod swimming in water. And the film has been done in high-speed video, high-speed cinematography, which is now slowed down for our view. And the issue here is that at the scales at which these organisms live, the adhesive forces of water, the viscous forces of water are much greater than that of the turbulent motion of the water. And what that means for us to understand is that if we were to be copepods and we were swimming in the ocean or in the lake, it would feel to us like we're swimming in honey in a very syrupy medium, right? So I'll play the video again and you can see how this copepod watch this. This wake, it's water that is being dragged by the copepod as it swims, as if you're swimming in honey or molasses. So that is an incredible amount of extra weight that the animals, and not just copepod, but anything swimming at those scales, carries around with them, which means that it's very energetically expensive for them to do. So it's a rough life that they live. So it's hard to live in this syrupy medium. But here's the kicker. When a copepod jumps to escape a predator or to capture prey, it turns out that it can do it at 1,000 times its own body size. 1,000 times its own body size. That would be the equivalent of me running 1,000 times, 1,000 times its own body size per second. So that would be the equivalent of me running 100-meter race in 1 second or so, right? Incredibly fast. Were I to be able to run that way all the time, I'd run as fast as a supersonic jet, more than 1,000 miles an hour, right? So this is actually quite hard to wrap our head around it. And not only that, to be able to do that, you require incredible amount of energy. So to jump 1,000 times your own body size per second actually makes you the strongest animal on Earth. So these tiny organisms happen to be quite extraordinary. Now, the other thing is that I told you that they can move. They cannot swim against the currents, but they can move up and down because the current velocities in the up and down direction are very tiny. And plankton, zooplankton in particular, perform these daily vertical migrations where they go from the surface to the deep waters and back to the surface. So they are at the surface at nighttime and they go down deep, well below where the sun can penetrate, the sunlight can penetrate, and then they come back. And the reason they do this is because they themselves are food for bigger things. So they escape the sunlit surface waters during the daytime, so they're not eaten. And then at nighttime, they come back to eat phytoplankton and other small creatures. In the process of doing that, migrating a few hundred meters, depending on their size, that would be the equivalent of you, me, running 4, 5, 6, 10 marathons a day. All right, so what about this relationship between copepods and our lives? Copepods, I'm sorry, plankton in our lives. So whether it be by the finfish we eat or the shellfish we eat, all of that is eventually related to the production of plankton, right? Because plankton are at the base of the food web. The plants are the base, and then they're consumed by tiny crustaceans, and those themselves become the food of fish that then are eaten by other fish, and then they're eaten by us. Or even things that live on the bottom derive their food directly from phytoplankton or from dead phytoplankton and dead organisms that originally were part of the plankton. In addition, of course, all of this food is necessary to have things like big whales, seals, seabirds, and polar bears. So the whole economy of the ocean, the whole ecology of the ocean is predicated on the existence of these planktonic organisms. And by the way, at this point, we're getting something in the vicinity of 100 million tons of animal protein from the sea. The geology of the planet is also affected by plankton. And an example of that is the White Cliffs of Dover in England. You can see these chalky cliffs here. They are formed by the remains of the coccolithophores we talked about before. So if you remember, before we had these fancy writing utensils, we used to use chalk and blackboards. And if there's a good chance that some of the chalk that you used came from the remains of fossilized coccolithophores. Now, there is also a connection between plankton fuels and climate. And it turns out that plankton are both part of the problem and the solution to the climate issue. You've heard this phrase, fossil fuels. We burn fossil fuels. Well, those fossil fuels came from the remains of fossilized organisms that originated at the base of the food web and then eventually were consumed and sank to the bottom of the ocean, where they were buried into the sediments, and under great pressure, they were liquefied into oil. Now we are, at this point, drawing on those fossil fuels and burning them very quickly and putting CO2 in the atmosphere. So paradoxically, plankton are part of the problem, right? Because they provided the source of the fossil fuels that we're burning now. But they're also part of the solution because remember the phytoplankton removes CO2, excess CO2 from the atmosphere for photosynthesis. And so in the process, they reset this whole cascade of events of removing CO2 from the atmosphere, incorporated them into their own tissue, being consumed, and the remains of organisms eventually going back down to the seafloor. All right, and that brings me now to our connection between plankton and human consciousness, right? So this is a picture of our brain, or a cartoon of our brain, and it turns out that we human beings and mammals in general, but we human beings and things that have big brains require a lot of oxygen. That's a requirement. We can't have big brains without a ton of oxygen. And we know that the oxygen comes from plants, and we typically think of plants on land providing the oxygen. But it turns out half of the oxygen that is produced, that is in the atmosphere that we breathe, it comes from the ocean, which is produced by the phytoplankton. So You take 2 breaths, make sure you think plankton for one of them and land plants for the other one. And now, okay, so what is the connection to the evolution of consciousness and plankton? Well, you have to consider the whole history of the Earth, right? So remember that the Earth is about 4.5 billion years old. And what I'm showing over on this axis here is the percentage of oxygen in the atmosphere. And notice that this scale here goes by powers of 10, okay? So that's a log scale on this end. 4.5 billion years ago, there was very, very little oxygen in the atmosphere, and that was the case for a very long time. The first cells showed up, their bacterial cells showed up about 4 billion years ago, and about 1 billion years later, the first photosynthesizers, which were the cyanobacteria, appear on Earth, and they start pumping oxygen into the atmosphere. That oxygen slowly, very slowly accumulated for a long time. And part of the reason for that is that the oxygen had to react with a bunch of other chemicals before it could accumulate. Once those reactions took course, the oxygen could start accumulating in the atmosphere, leading to the evolution of aerobic metabolism, which is what we use to respire, and eventually the evolution of plants on land, animals, and eventually after the demise of dinosaurs, mammals. And notice that about that time we reach 20% of the composition of the atmosphere, it's oxygen. And I think we're about 21%. And if we go a little bit below this value, we're toast. We can't function. So if were it not for the evolution of this oxygenic photosynthesis, were it not for these humble creatures, the cyanobacteria that miraculously started this process of photosynthesis, none of this would have happened. We would have not had brains, and I would not be here to tell you that story. Okay, so be thankful to these humble creatures, for otherwise we would not be here. All right, so I told you that one of the byproducts of consciousness is the fact that I'm here telling you this story, and other endeavors such as architecture and design. And I'm going to show you 2 examples in how architecture, design, and art derive inspiration from Plankton. And we'll going back to the famous illustration by Haeckel of radiolaria. Now, Haeckel became a bit of a sensation in 1904 when he published a book called Art Forms in Nature. And in some of the illustrations in this book, he had, I think, about 20 illustrations of Plankton, and the radiolaria were one of them. Now, look at the figures here. Look at the intricate architecture of the shells of these tiny radiolarias. People at the time when they read the book started borrowing ideas, and one of them is the gate of the Place de la Concorde in Paris. You can see here the gate to the square. It looks very much like one of these fellows here, and the architecture drew inspiration from that. And this is the inside of the Sagrada Familia Basilica in Barcelona, Spain. And if you were to look, to peer in the inside of one of these radiolaria, you would see features that look just like the church. Yeah. So that's one example there. The other example is, I love this little one because it's this fellow here, Klaus Kemp, diatomist. That's the name, right? He is recovering the lost art of the Victorian lost art of diatom arrangement. Now, remember that the diatoms are the tiny single cells that have glass shells. So he makes art with them. I'm going to show you a bit of the video.
The microscopists in the Victorian times were very good at making beautiful arrangements of diatoms. I wanted to find out how was this done.
So anyway, he makes these arrangements on microscopic slides, and I'm going to show you some examples of that. So I've showed you the beauty of these organisms, right, and the relationship to our lives in some form. And I now want to just give you a sense of urgency for the problems that they're facing. And those problems are related to four processes, the four horsemen of the global change apocalypse, as I call them: eutrophication, deoxygenation, warming, and acidification. Right? So not everything is well in the world of plankton. And the problem is that these processes have both direct and indirect effect on these organisms. And the issue here is that all of these things bring a disconnect between the different groups of plankton, because the ones at the base of the food, the phytoplankton, grow very fast, and they may be able to adapt to the stresses produced by these processes. But the larger lived organism, they grow much more slowly, and they may not be able to catch up. So the first problem I'm going to discuss is the issue of the eutrophication and deoxygenation. And this happens in Long Island Sound. The figure here shows a map of Long Island Sound and the problem of deoxygenation. So if you look at the colors, where it shows blue, it means areas of Long Island Sound in which we hardly ever see oxygen getting to be too low to be a problem for the survival of organisms. But where it's red, the problem is quite severe. Now, why do we have this deoxygenation of the sound, the Western Sound? And the reason for that is because we have too many people in the Western Sound, and wherever we are, too many of us, we're putting lots of nutrients into the water. The excess nutrients are not great for the plankton. A little nutrient is great, a lot of nutrients is not, because it leads to uncontrolled growth of the plankton. That plankton then dies, and it sinks to the bottom where it gets decomposed by bacteria. Now, remember, bacteria don't produce oxygen. They have to use oxygen to do this decomposition. And in the process, they deplete the water of oxygen. So the solution to the eutrophication and deoxygenation problem is we have to lower the nutrient influx. And that's why you see the EPA and the Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection working hard to limit nutrient influxes into the sound. And it turns out it's starting to work. Nutrients have gone down, and we're just starting to see improvement in the water quality of the sound. The other problem I mentioned is this proliferation of toxic prey. They, in particular, of these dinoflagellates that produce neurotoxins. And here's an example from my own research. So look at this video. This is a copepod eating a tiny dinoflagellate that produces a neurotoxin. And this is 24 hours later. See how lethargic the copepod is? Okay, this neurotoxins immobilize the predator. So I'll play the video again. At the beginning, it's happily eating. You see the cells here. And then 24 hours later, it's very lethargic, and it's swimming erratically. Now that's a problem because this toxic algae can then be transferred throughout the food web, so they bioaccumulate, and then they can be magnified and eventually made it to top predators, including us, humans, or to things like oysters and mussels and clams that live on the sea bottom. And that's the reason why you see this signs where there's closure of shellfish beds, for example. Or you see this article on top featuring the Atlantic a couple of years ago that illustrates the devastation to the local fisheries and traditions of Alaska by the proliferation of these toxic plants. And again, they're related to excess nutrients. When we put too many nutrients in the water, these plants can proliferate and grow out of control and wreak havoc on the ecology of the ocean. All right, the last thing, it's the issue of warming and acidification, right? How they challenge plankton. So aquatic systems are suffering from simultaneous warming and acidification, which are both related to the accumulation in the atmosphere of excess carbon dioxide, CO2, that comes from fossil fuel burning. Warming and acidification are happening together, right? So the excess CO2 that comes from the fossil fuels increases the greenhouse effect, which raises global temperature. Now, a lot of that CO2 is absorbed by the ocean, by the drawdown of the CO2 by the phytoplankton. But not all of that can be used because there are other things that limit the photosynthesis, not just the CO2. So the excess CO2, it's in the water, and then it reacts with other things, and in the process lowers the pH, leading to what we call acidification. Now that's a problem because the lowering of the pH leads to the dissolution of calcareous shells of many types of organisms, and importantly also affects the ionic balance within the cells of these organisms, which means then that the organisms have to spend more energy in dealing with the stress, and they can survive and grow as well. So the combined warming and acidification can increase the stress on them. Now, this has happened. Acidification and warming have happened throughout the history of the Earth. This is not new. The problem is that it is happening now at rates, faster rates than we've observed in many, many, many millions of years. So it's incredibly fast. And the question then becomes, can plankton adapt, right? And we don't know, right? And we may not have the luxury of waiting and doing experiments for hundreds of years to see if plankton and the things that depend on them can adapt. So one solution, of course, is we have to lower the CO2 emissions, right? We have to be creative about switching to other forms of energy that are not constantly burning fossil fuels. So I'm going to skip this bit here on the left, but the issue is that in the end, illustrated by the figure on the right, we're dealing with a problem that has multiple drivers and, simultaneous acidification, warming, proliferation of toxic blooms, and deoxygenation. And eventually we'll want to figure out what the response of the biota is to the simultaneous stresses at the organismal level, the community level, and eventually the ecosystem level, because ecosystems are the things that provide the services that we relied on, such as oxygen production and food from the sea. And we want to see that now, but we also want to see whether that organisms can cope with that in the future, right? Whether it can adapt to that. And we're just at the infancy of those studies. We're just beginning to realize the studies, so that is a challenge at the moment. So I want to thank everybody for your attention, for giving me the opportunity to introduce you to the wonderful world of Plankton. And I hope that now you relate to the figure on the upper left, right? That you've gone from the cartoon to being able to say, oh, that's Plankton, that's Plankton, that's Plankton. And I hope that you can now make the connection between the presence of Plankton and how it affects us and how we are in some form related to them, and that you have a perhaps an understanding of the problems they face and what it is that we can do to solve and manage them. Thank you. I'll take questions now.
Thank you. I have a couple of questions here from some of our participants tonight. But one question that I have to begin with is, given the incredible energy levels that plankton, the amount of energy that they have to produce to migrate from the top of the ocean to the bottom, and then back up during a 24-hour period, or the amount of energy they have to expend to feed, whether it's jumping 1,000 times their weight. How much do they actually eat?
Well, these things, they can eat easily. They can eat 100% of their own body weight a day. So a little copepod, right?
Right.
So imagine yourself every day eating your own body weight.
Right.
And sometimes they exceed that. I mean, that's the smaller one, the little ciliates, they eat many times their own body weight a day. So they're incredibly voracious in that sense, because they have this high energy requirements, right? So they have to eat a lot. And so that's the other thing, that it's, we tend to think of the ocean and we think of fish and whales and being really important. Of course they are, but the economy of the ocean is ruled by these tiny organisms, because that's where you process most of the carbon and excrete most of the nutrients and respire most of the CO2 is in these really, really tiny things in the plankton.
Well, it is amazing, I must admit. Related to that, though, another question is, how do they reproduce?
Well, the phytoplankton, they just divide, right? For the most part, sometimes they do like the diatoms. When they get too tiny, because in the process of reproduction, one part of the cell gets smaller than the other, right? And eventually they can get too tiny. And when that is the case, and I don't know how they do this, but they do it, they have sexual reproduction. They mate, and then they start the process again. Okay. The protozoa are, again, they just divide as well. They're not sexual. Although they have, again, when they go through this process where they get senescent, and they don't have sex like we do, but they do have sex in the sense that they exchange genetic material. And animals, of course, most animals are sexually reproducing. Some of the jellyfish, they do a combination of sexual and asexual reproduction. So,
okay, all right. Is there a count of how many different types of species of plankton there are?
Sorry, I'm sorry.
How many different types of planktonic?
Well, okay, so copepods, there's about 11,000 species. For example, there are 1,000 species, generally speaking, for each one of those groups that I talked about. Maybe not jellyfish, but when particularly in the phytoplankton, there's 1,000 species. Within each group, there's 1,000 species. countless number of species. And every day we discover new ones.
Okay, all right. Another question is temperature the number one issue? Is it, are they threatened by plastics in the?
Yeah, I didn't talk about microplastics and microplastics, which is a hot commodity in research these days, of course, because there's a huge amount of microplastics in the ocean. And of course, these little things are eating them, right? And it's sometimes they do nothing, but sometimes it's quite harmful. I mean, to the point that, you know, some of these organisms, they're full of microplastic and then they die because they're not getting the nutrition from the things that they need. But I would say that's an emergent area of research, microplastic effects on ocean biology.
Right, right. Okay, so another question that's come up is discounting predation and environmental factors.
Yeah.
What is the average natural lifespan for
Okay,
plankton?
so here's the thing, the things that divide, right, technically they live forever. So like the phytoplankton, right, each cell is an organism and it splits into two that are genetically identical. Now each cell is different from each other, but once it divides, that's the lifetime, right? And that happens in a matter of hours to days. For example, for the animals, the little crustaceans like the copepods, their generation time, depending on temperature, may be a week to a month around here. If you go to polar regions where it's very, very cold, it's more like a year or two or so, right? So that's typically what, you know, how long it will take them to become an adult. Now the question is, once they're an adult, how long do they hang around? Because they get eaten very fast, right? And some of if they make it for a week, they're lucky.
Really?
Yes, they're lucky. Yeah, because they're food, you know?
Okay.
So you don't see too many old copepods. In the lab, you see very old copepods because there's no predation. In nature, you don't see too many old copepods, for example, because they're eaten quite quickly after they mature. Yeah.
That's really interesting. Plankton in freshwater. Are there plankton in freshwater?
Oh, yes. Yeah, of course, I talk mostly about the ocean, but yeah, lakes are full of plankton. Very similar. I mean, some differences, but you know, there's copepods, there's diatoms, there's cyanobacteria. Cyanobacteria are big in lakes, for example. There's plankton in lakes, in ponds. There's plankton in rivers, and there's plankton in the atmosphere.
So let me ask you, these tiny organisms, if you had a scanning net out there, would we be able to scan that to pick them up?
Yeah, I mean, you have to have a little net. You know, the mesh has to be really small so that you can collect them, right? Because they're so tiny. Right. But yeah, that's you know, that's how we do it.
So children in our science program.
Sometimes what you can do is just grab a jar, like a glass jar, and then, you know, recycled mayonnaise jar, right, and put it in the water, right, and then bring the jar to the light because they like the light, they follow the light, and then you can see them. Because some of this, you know, remember they're 1 millimeter or so. So if you train your eye, you can actually see them without a microscope. You can see them swim into the light or so.
All right, everybody, get out your mayonnaise jars. All right, one last question from David. You showed how and I'm going to struggle with this one, the coccolithophores.
The coccolithophores, right.
Okay, can reveal ocean currents in satellite images. Right. Can you see these changes in ocean currents at the surface level, for instance, on a boat or on a passenger ship?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, yes. I mean, so this is the discoloration of the water, right? If the bloom is intense enough, you can see it. For instance, some coccolithophores particularly, right? You can cruise through them and you can see that the water is milky white. I mean, they don't happen all the time everywhere. That's the thing, right? So you have to be a little lucky to see that. But the same thing with these dinoflagellates, right? You've heard the term red tide. They're not red, they're not tide, but they discolor the water, and you can see that. You can see that, you know, if you were up in the third floor of a building and you were looking out at the water, you might well see the patches of these organisms. Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, so I think we have, I mean, I think we ran out of time.
Yeah, it's 7 o'clock.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I want to thank you, Hans. This has been just a great and enlightening lecture about these tiny organisms that I think so many of us have taken for granted. And for those of you who are boaters out there who are out scraping the bottom of your boats, I just want to tell you that yes, those barnacles originated from plankton. I also tonight want to thank our staff who operate behind the scenes to make these lectures happen. And to all of you who've let us come into your homes and interrupt your space, thank you for tuning in. And a special thanks to our donors, those who have donated. You are the ones who make these programs possible and our children's education programs possible. We look forward to seeing you again, virtually, but hopefully soon in person. Join one of our community programs. Come and visit us soon at our new home on Lime Street in Old Lyme. We will be officially in residence sometime in the latter part of August. Our staff will move in, but this summer we're holding summer camp there. So please, if you're up to it, stop by and say hello. Thank you very much for being with us tonight. Hans, again, it's great to see you and thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Appreciate the opportunity to share the passion. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Hans. Bye, everybody. Stay well, stay safe.